anytime you want.
Okay. Um, my name is Esther Mariana Rosa Posner, and I'm sitting here in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and I'm here to tell you my story of what happened to me and my family in the Netherlands during World War II. I'm so filled with gratitude for my children, for Aryeh Hanan and Danny for bringing me here this week, because they wanted me to get the story in the place where it happened for my grandchildren and for their descendants. I'm going to start from the beginning, telling you how this all came about. I'll never understand how it all came about, but I'll tell you what actually our role was, what our path was, what decisions we made, and how we saved our lives. My father was a kosher butcher in Germany and came to Holland when Hitler came to power. And he came to Amsterdam. And it's very interesting that I recently found out some information that I never knew. My father, from what I knew from what the story was, he had a partner, and some of the things that have been by the people that I worked with who were helping me do some research, I found out that my father had this butcher store with his partner, and that there was a rock thrown through the window with an anti-Semitic message. This was in '38, before Hitler came to Holland. Anyway, my earliest memories go back to that store because my father went to work every morning. My mother came a couple of hours later, and she took me with her. And my early pictures, my childhood pictures, were all taken in and around that butcher store because there was a garden behind it, and photography didn't do well indoors, and so the pictures of me as a baby were taken outside in that garden in the butcher store where my parents had their business. My father sent for my mother in 1936. He had come in '33. In 1936, he sent for my mother and felt he could support her. And they got married at the Amsterdam Rabbinat, the Rabbinate of Amsterdam, with many other immigrant couples. And I was born a year later. And my parents did everything they could. All their efforts were put into bringing their parents, their families, their sisters from Germany to Holland, because Holland had been neutral during World War I. And they had every expectation that the same thing would happen during the war that came. So I grew up with a large family around me. My grandparents moved in with us from Germany, my mother's parents, and my father's parents also lived not far from us, and we went to visit them every Sunday. And my aunts, who had jobs during the week, came on Sunday to be with their parents and to be with us. And so I had a lot of family around me, and I was the only child, so I really was the first niece, and they all made a big fuss over me. I have pictures of myself with clothing that they bought me, very pretty embroidered dresses, and the next thing we knew is that Holland was invaded by Germany. That was in May of 1940, and the Germans were goose-stepping down the street in front of our house on the Scheldestraat. Nothing changed very much in the first year, but in 1941, all the rules that you all know about and that you read about, what Jews couldn't do, including the fact that they couldn't own businesses anymore, they couldn't go to parks, they couldn't ride the trains, they couldn't even own bicycles, they couldn't go to schools with Christians, and so our life changed dramatically. And when I tell my story in schools in the United States, I tell them my story is the Anne Frank story with a happy ending. We went into hiding, and we survived. It was in 1942 that my aunt went into hiding, my Tante Ulla, who was living in Enschede, and there was a Dutch policeman who found her a hiding place. We've kind of talked about that story in Enschede today, and we went after several attempts. We also, my father and my mother and I, also went into hiding. By this time, my grandparents had been deported, and my aunt and uncle and baby cousin had been deported. We had been a family of 8 living together in one house, one apartment, and they were deported. And just my parents and I were left. And we had each time been brought to the Schouwburg, which was a Dutch theater. At some point, Jewish artists were no longer allowed to perform for general audiences. They could only perform for Jewish audiences, and that took place at the Schouwburg. It was called the Joodse Schouwburg, but it only lasted for about 6 months. Jewish artists, such as musicians and people who played in the orchestras and things like that, they performed at the Joodse Schouwburg for Jews. But that, at some point, was diabolically turned into a terrible place where Jews were gathered for deportation. It changed over time. It started with young people being called up to work in Germany, and when they went, after that, there was like a quota every week of the number of people that had to be sent to Germany. And it was about 800 people. So you went to the Schouwburg. We went there. We were brought there, and by the Nazis and the Dutch collaborators, the police, and we had to wait till I think it was a Tuesday or Wednesday when they had about 700 or 800 people, and until that time you slept in the Schouwburg. Well, there was one room for men and one room for women. And when the time came for us to all leave, we got up with our little package, with our little suitcase, and we were deported. But we escaped each time because my father had a stamp on his passport, which was called a sperre, and it was a way in which it declared that you were needed by the government in the Netherlands right now. And it could change over time, anytime, but for right now, we were told we could go home. And so we were in the Schouwburg 3 times. First time, the whole family was sent home. Second time, my aunt and uncle were deported. And the third time, my grandparents had been deported from our apartment in the ghetto, Amsterdam Zuid. And the third time, we were on the truck that was taking us to the train station. And somebody came to the back of the truck and said, who's here? And my father gave his name, Fritz Rose, and the person said, jump down. The person who came out there was a member of the Joodse Raad, and which was like the Judenrat, and it was someone who knew my father and told him to escape. It was in May 1943, a very cloudy, foggy night, and I can still see the light that was outside, the outside light that was outside the Schouwburg, completely surrounded with this thick fog. And we jumped out. We jumped down and ran across the street, and there were German soldiers all around, and nobody stopped us, nobody saw us, nobody heard us. And we went to a place across the street from the Schouwburg that was called the Creche. And the creche is where the Germans sent children during the week so that they wouldn't be underfoot while the parents were being getting ready for deportation. So we go into the creche, and they were very nice. Apparently we weren't the first people that had done this. And they got in touch with Dick Moss and with a woman whose name my father gave them. And she took us to the train on a hearse. She got a hearse. A hearse is a funeral car. And she took us to the train station, not in Amsterdam because there were too many Gestapo there, and which is the German police, secret police. And we went to, I think, Amersfoort, and got on the train there, and with our little package, our little suitcases, and we got off in Enschede, and there we were met by Dick Moss. Dick Moss was the man who had found my aunt her hiding place. And from there we were taken to the Kleinjan family, and that's where we lived for the next year and a half, in a room on the second floor of the house, the small little house, and there we hid in one room, six people, 5 adults and a child. It was my parents and I, Fritz and Ellen Rose, and me, Mariana. And my grandfather was there, Rudolph Rose, and my Aunt Ula was there with her mother-in-law. And in the morning, I slept in that room where there was a hiding place. And today, one of the women told me, who was at the lunch, where we invited all the rescuers' descendants, their children and grandchildren, and some other relatives. And I asked them, one of them said to me, you know, my father built that wall that the hiding place was behind. And I said, how did he know to do that? She said, I don't know, but he told us he built it himself. It was like the Anne Frank story where you see the revolving bookcase. It was a wall with a bookcase behind it, a bookcase in front of it, and if you moved that bookcase a little, there was a hole behind that bookcase, and there was the place where we could stand and hide. We tried to get into the house today, but we couldn't. We were with the Kleinjans for a year and a half, and summer vacations, I was brought downstairs, and it was just, the story was that I was visiting. I was a niece, and I was visiting, and during my school vacation, my father was in Germany working, and my mother was in the hospital. She was ill. So I would come down, and the Kleinjans took me to Bad Bukalo, very lovely place, unbelievable that during the war, a place like that was thriving, and people were going there. You know, for me, a child who had been in hiding for almost a year, it was incredible to be in a place like that, so beautiful. We were just in Enschede today, and the environments in Delden, and we all were amazed how beautiful that part of the country is. And the Kleinjan family, the parents, just put me on the back of their bikes. They took their own 2 children. One on the father took one child on the back and one in the front, and Mrs. Kleinjan took me on the back, and then we went to Bad Bukalo. And so, as I said, we were there a year and a half. There were searches while we were there. The Germans came into the house. They went from room to room, and it was very difficult standing there knowing they were in the house and knowing they came into the room that we were hiding in, the room with the hiding place. To tell you one more story, and that is that in the morning when I woke up, and I was sleeping with Tante Ulla and her mother-in-law in one bed, and I would look up, and next to my bed stood, in front of the hiding place, stood my father with a talis and tefillin, and he davened every morning. And next to the bed where I was lying stood Tante Yetchen, my aunt's mother-in-law, and she would daven every morning. And it seemed to me that this is many, many years later. I said to myself, I wonder what the zechut was that she received for doing that. And believe it or not, she had lost her son. My aunt's husband had died, but she had another son who had escaped and gone to Argentina. And that son has a son who lives in Colombia, and he is the chief rabbi of Colombia. And he came last year in September, October, to visit us in Detroit. and he spoke to our community, to our shul. And who came? Donnie? You didn't come? Okay. And it was really an incredible experience, and it was really great to be there. Anyway, so to get back to the story of what was happening during the war, after a year and a half, it was impossible for the Klangon family to keep us. The conditions changed dramatically, and it seemed like the war was never going to end. In the beginning, it seemed that it might be over any day. As a matter of fact, my whole family was constantly trying to teach me to read. My father was trying to teach me to do that, and the rest of the family was testing me on arithmetic. You know, Mayana, what's 6 times 7? What's 2 plus 19? And they wanted to make sure that if school started, if the war ended and school started, I would be ready and I wouldn't be behind in school. So I tried to keep up with school, but we felt that by 1943, the war news was very bad. And as I said, Mr. Klangon became very depressed and went to the underground organization that had found us our first hiding place. And we were brought to another place. We were separated. We were all taken to different places. And my parents went to one place and I went to another. And the place that I went to was the Tilsma family. And I was received there with such warmth and love that I was very happy there. Every Sunday, a young girl came, different one every week, and put me in the back of her bike and took me over to where my parents were staying with the Tenteya family. And I spent Sundays with my parents. And my mother would take me aside and she would say to me, you have to tell me the name of the people where you're staying and the house and the address. And I had been told every time I got on that bike to go to visit my parents that you cannot tell your parents where you are. If they are found, they will be interrogated and they will be tortured until they give up the information. So I did not tell my mother for about a month where we were staying. I just want to go back to one thing that I forgot to tell you before about the Klangons, and that is when I speak in schools, the public schools or the day schools, Jewish day schools, I bring one thing with me, and that is the tablecloth that my mother embroidered while we were in hiding. My mother's parents had a business where they sold textiles, and one of the things they sold was tablecloths. And in those days, people liked having fancy tablecloths, and most of them were embroidered. And they had all kinds of different handiwork on them. They had colorful embroidery. They had all kinds of other stitching. They had cut work. They had pulled thread. And these are all things that my mother learned and her sister learned in their parents' business. My mother had this one tablecloth, and somewhere along the line, somehow she had brought it in her small suitcase. I always wonder how she found the room, but she figured she might as well put her time to good use while we were in hiding, and she took out her tablecloth and started working on it, and it's got beautiful colors, beautiful flowers, and when I show it to students, one student said to me, "That's not a tablecloth, that's a work of art," and it really impresses the kids when they see it. It's something that I still have, and as I said, I take it with me when I speak to schools. So now here I am at Tilsma, and my parents are at the Tenteya house. What happened at the Tenteya house is that the two daughters, one was Adi and one was Lisha, and Lisha was the younger daughter. She was about 15. And whenever I came on Sundays, I sat on her lap and she told me stories, and I loved her very much. And one Sunday, I was sitting on her lap and I said to her, "I have a feeling I'm never going to see you again." And that week, she and her sister went to a meeting of the underground organization, and when they came out, there was a bombing and Lisha was killed. and her sister got wounded and had to be hospitalized. And so my parents had to leave immediately because the poor family, the poor mother, who was a widow, could really not at that point take care of other people. And my parents were brought to where I was at the Tilsma house. All these narrow escapes that we had, and all these wonderful people who saved us. It's a miracle, and that's the only way I can look at it. So anyway, my parents came to the Tilsmas, and we had a very wonderful time with them. My I remember that we celebrated Christmas with them. We helped the family celebrate, and they included us in everything that was going on in the family. And the end of January, this is now 1945, my parents were only with the Tilsmas for about 2 months, and I had been there about 4 months altogether. The end of January, one day it had been snowing outside, and I went outside to go sledding with Femi, their daughter, and my mother had gone to a funeral. My father's sister Elsa, her husband had died, and Elsie looked very, very Jewish. She had black hair and dark eyes, and the underground was making the funeral, and they did not allow her to leave where she was staying, where she was hiding. But they said my mother could come. She had blonde hair and gray eyes, and she did not look Jewish. So my mother went to this funeral. I was sledding, and my father is sitting in front of the window with the Tilsmas parents, schmoozing with them, and all of a sudden the Gestapo pulls up in front of the house, and somebody comes running in, and my father runs upstairs to the attic, and through the going on the roofs from one house to another, he escapes and runs out back and gets over to the school where Mr. Tilsma was a principal. Meanwhile, Mrs. Tilsma comes outside, and she says to me, "Don't come in the house. The Germans are there. You can't come back." And there are several versions of how I finally got to where my parents were, but somebody came from the underground on a bike and put me on the back and biked me over to where my mother now was, at the Tilsma, this lady who had lost her daughter. And my father, in his painting, when he got to the school, Mrs. Tilsma sent him a pair of Mrs. Tenteya sent him a pair of coveralls and a paint bucket, because they had a combination paint store and drugstore. I mean, we've never heard of that, but that's what it was in those days. And my father put those clothes on and left there holding the paint bucket and walked over to Tenteya. And we slept there overnight, the three of us. And the next morning, my father tied this rope, the famous rope, to a bicycle and to a sled. And then I got on the back of the sled, and my mother biked to meet the next place where I was going, and that was in Delden. She met him about halfway, and it was winter, and I was getting splashed by the trucks that were whizzing by us. And then she met a man she'd never met, and a man I had never seen in my life, and I went with him. I trusted him. He put my little suitcase on his bike, and he put me in the back or in the front, I don't remember, and we went home to their family. And the first person that I meet there is my Tante Ola. That's where she had been sent. And she says, "Don't call me Tante. I'm not, nobody's supposed to know I'm your aunt." So, but the family was wonderful to me, and they had 2 sons. One was my age, and one was about 2 or 3 years younger than I was. And in that lovely area, Delden, where we were today, and my sons, Arya, Hanan, and Dani, saw how pretty it is. What I did is I roamed the forest with the boys and played in the vegetation and the flowers, and went over to the castle and played in front of that in the rhododendron bushes. And I just found out today, I didn't know it, but I thought, I knew there were Germans in there, but I just found out it was Seis Inquart, who was the the equivalent of what Hitler was in Germany. He was that in Holland, and was responsible for all the deportations of all the Jews. And in Delden is where my parents, they had gone to another place in between, which became unsafe, and they were brought to where I was in Delden. And in Delden, we celebrated the liberation at some point. So that in brief is the story. Okay, can we stop?